Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I'm your host, Alex. Every week, find a video on something to do, and we are certainly in the dark times on Chargers news that'll not start again for another 2 or 3 weeks when training camp does eventually ramp up. But I did find an interesting topic that I wanted to talk about this week and talk about where the Chargers rank in the league in terms of playmakers. So this was an article that came out from ESPN Plus, done by Bill Barnwell, where he ranked all 32 teams in terms of playmakers around the league. This is running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. Basically, a ranking of weapons. And we often do debate on Twitter, which quarterbacks have the better weapons. If you're part of the great Tua Herbert debate on Twitter, that is something that does constantly come up. And we do use it to kind of compare what quarterbacks have in their arsenal on their team. So I thought it was worth ranking where the Chargers exactly stand. And so we'll get into where Barnwell ranked the Chargers in these rankings. But I've also gone through the process and done my own top 10 and sort of reasoned it out myself. I toiled it out at the coffee table and hope that they make sense. I'm sure I'll have some logic gaps somewhere and make some exceptions. But some of the rules, when we talk about ground rules here, I do think injuries matter. Unfortunately, this isn't Madden where you can turn the injury sliders off. And unfortunately for the Chargers, that's been the last couple of years where you talk about Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. So that is something that will come into consideration when ranking these teams if there are, significant kind of injury bugs to consider, right? Are your players going to miss time? Are your players a little bit older, generally speaking? I also do think when we talk about the premium positions, the NFL is kind of at the point where if you have a really good top 5 wide receiver, that does kind of overrule having a top 5 running back, having a top 5 tight end. So my second rule is that wide receivers kind of win out. Obviously, that kind of depends on receiver to receiver, but you'll see some teams that maybe aren't as deep at running back and tight end higher on my list if they do have 2 or 3 top 15, top 20 guys, just because that is where the game is gravitating towards. And then, another thing is that this is about 2023 performance. We're not drafting teams for the next 5 years or doing any of that. So in this circumstance, like the contract situation of Eckler or Gerald Everett being in the last year of their deals, that doesn't matter quite as much to me here. So without any further ado, I guess we'll get started. I will start with some honorable mentions of offenses and playmakers around the league that did not crack my list. So again, also important to note, this is not regarding quarterbacks. This is running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. So there's going to be some teams that have great quarterbacks in here, and there's going to be some teams that have terrible quarterbacks in here. But it's just about what is their offensive makeup, what offensive weapons do they have. And so on 10th on Bill Barnwell's list was the Atlanta Falcons. I have them outside of my top 10, but they do have Drake London, Mac Hollins, Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, and then Cordell Patterson's still there, which is kind of surprising to me, and Kyle Pitts. The reason that I did not put them in my top 10 is I just believe they're a little bit thin right now, particularly at wide receiver and tight end. Other than Drake London and Mac Hollins, it's kind of nobody. Kyle Pitts, as much as I do like him, also took a little bit of a step back last year, and I don't think he has yet entered that echelon of being a top 5 tight end around the league. Did take a step back in quite a number of metrics last season. So Bijan's going to be great. Drake is going to be great. I do think Kyle Pitts is still a quality tight end with a lot of potential, but to me, to be in this top 10 when we talk about playmakers, I do think you have to be a little bit deeper than the Falcons are, because they are kind of a Drake London or a Bijan or Kyle Pitts injury away from being very vertically challenged on offense. So that's worth pointing out. I guess that's less so a Bijan problem because they do have Algier and Cordell Patterson to pick up some of the slack, but particularly when we're talking about wide receivers and tight ends, they're just not that deep. The Steelers. Bill Barnwell had them 13th. I also think of them as a general top 15 offense in terms of playmakers. They got Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson kind of is a buy low situation for the Steelers right now, in terms of trying to rebuild his value after his stint with the Rams. And they have Najee Harris and Pat Freiermuth. I think if Najee Harris was playing a little bit better, I would have them in the top 10, just because I do think they have a formidable wide receiver group. Freiermuth is a good tight end. But Najee Harris averaged 3.8 yards per carry last year. And you could talk about the Steelers' struggles on the offensive line a little bit, but it's kind of been a downward slope for him in terms of production recently in these past couple of years. So for me, I don't think Najee Harris has quite lived up to the expectation of being one of those top backs. And I think, considering what the Steelers' offense is, they sort of need that if they're going to get into the top 10. Ravens. Barnwell ranked them 15th. I think pretty highly of the Ravens, although, to be fair to Barnwell, the reason that he didn't rank them that high is because there is a lot of uncertainty, right? OBJ is, the big offensive signing, the big offensive get. OBJ also hasn't played since the Rams Super Bowl win, right? Did not play last year, was rehabbing that knee. Zay Flowers, obviously a rookie coming in. Who knows quite what he's going to be in year one. J.K. Dobbins, really solid back, obviously averaging 6 yards a carry. He's a freak, and he has another year coming off of that knee injury. And so, then you have Mark Andrews, obviously top 5 tight end at the position, and Isaiah Likely. So this is an offense that I don't think is top 10 right now, but considering the offensive coordinator change, considering some of the pieces they got, Odell doesn't have to be prime Odell or anything to return this offense to being top 10 in the league, especially with the quarterback like Lamar Jackson. And I do think this group of playmakers is a really solid core to build around that only really has room to go up. The Chiefs. I think it's worth talking about the Chiefs. I know that the Chiefs kind of get undersold a little bit. They did have Juju Smith-Schuster leave them in the offseason. I don't think that's a big loss for them personally. Barnwell ranked them 19th, and I get why, in theory, you would have the Chiefs on the lower end. Patrick Mahomes is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and they don't necessarily have a star player on their offense outside of Travis Kelce. But Marquez Valdes-Scantling was really good for them last year. I think if you get a little bit more consistent production out of Kadarius Toney, then that is, again, that's a big if, that's a big question mark. But I think he showed flashes of, again, why the Giants drafted him so high and then inexplicably traded him to the Chiefs. And then you have Sky Moore, who scored a touchdown against the Eagles in the Super Bowl, which is really great. I was high on him in the draft, and of course, Pacheco gave me pain too. But this is a really solid group. Travis Kelce, obviously, still great. And Pacheco and McKinnon is a really great backfield to have for the Chiefs, particularly McKinnon in the receiving game. And Isaiah Pacheco, I think, is really getting to the point where he could be considered top 10 back in not much time. I think that the way that he was running towards the end of last year is that like big physical, bowl you over runner. I think he's going to open a lot of eyes this year, particularly in the regular season for the Chiefs. That being said, these are actually my top 10 teams. I will start with number 10 being the Jacksonville Jaguars. I believe they were number 9 in the Bill Barnwell rankings. I originally wanted to put this team in honorable mentions, and the reason why I wanted to do it was because Calvin Ridley is a big if, right? But then you look at the offense outside of Calvin Ridley and realize, okay, yeah, it's still really good. They have Christian Kirk, Zay Jones. They built that connection with Trevor Lawrence. Evan Ingram went for 760 yards last year. And you have Travis Etienne, who another year removed from his foot injury. He was already explosive as hell last year. He could reach another level as a playmaker and as an explosive force for this offense. Drafted Tank Bigsby as well to have there in the backfield to maybe take the load off of Etienne sometimes. So if Etienne takes another leap, the sky is kind of the limit for this offense. I don't know if they necessarily have an elite... I would say like an elite top 5 player at any position, but just a bunch of really good players. And then you have Calvin Ridley coming back, who, again, when he was in Atlanta, was really solid. He can take another step forward too, right? So just stay off of the FanDuel and the DraftKings and all that kind of stuff. But I think he can really elevate this group in terms of being a wide receiver trio and also has the potential to really assert himself as an alpha in that offense as well. And they basically gave up nothing to get him. I know we're not talking about like pick value and draft value and all these things in terms of how these teams are built. We're just talking about who they have on the roster. But they took a very buy low risk on Calvin Ridley. And if Calvin Ridley returns to his Atlanta form, then I think the sky is the limit, like I said, for the Jaguars. And they also have Evan Ingram, who is playing on the franchise tag, playing in a contract here. And, he's going to want to get his touches too and make them as productive as possible. So at number 10, I do have the Jacksonville Jaguars. Before you thumbs down the video, I do have the Las Vegas Raiders at number 9. This is a team that I didn't originally think would be in my top 10, and I think they were just outside the top 10 on Barnwell's ranking. I believe they were 11th. But look, they just have really solid players. Like I don't know what to tell you. Again, are they going to be a top 10 offense? No, because they're going to be quarterbacked by Jimmy Garoppolo or whoever the quarterback is on opening day, because they might have to cut Jimmy Garoppolo. But in terms of their offensive playmakers, I mean, this is a pretty fearsome group to throw out there. You have Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, and Hunter Renfrow as your kind of wide receiver trio here. Devontae, obviously the best receiver in the league, arguably the best receiver in the league if you want to put Justin Jefferson or somebody ahead of him, but he's easily top 3. And Myers and Renfrow are really good supplementary receivers. I also really liked Michael Mayer throughout the draft process. Chargers passed on him. The Raiders took him. And so he's a ready-to-play tight end. I don't think he's going to explode in his first year. He's not going to replace all of Darren Waller's production, which they're losing. But Darren Waller was also a little bit older, a little bit gimpier in his last couple of years in Las Vegas. And they have arguably the best running back in the league. I have a running back that I would put above Josh Jacobs personally in terms of running intensity and all these things. But Josh Jacobs is that guy, as we see. Can he do it again? Who knows? But what he showed last year was really promising if you are the Raiders. Major factors in terms of being higher or lower on this list come the end of the season is obviously the Josh Jacobs contract situation and how that gets resolved. I don't think Josh Jacobs has a whole lot of leverage, though. I don't think Saquon has a whole lot of leverage, though. Tony Pollard already signed his franchise tag. So in that sense, I don't see Josh Jacobs winning this spat with the Raiders unless he takes a deal that's less than the market value he kind of wants. And other points, like I've said, I think Michael Mayer is going to be day one ready. I don't think he's going to have like a tight end explosion. There's very few rookie tight ends who truly break out. But I do think they have the requisite tight end and wide receiver depth / situations to make up for the loss of Darren Waller in their offense from the trade to the Giants. Number 8, this was a team that was outside Bill Barnwell's top 10, but I have the Cleveland Browns in here. I think a lot of people undervalue the Browns playmakers. They got Amari Cooper, they have Donovan Peoples-Jones, Elijah Moore, Nick Chubb, and David Njoku, and of course my sweet prince, Jerome Ford. But this is a really solid, well-built team. I think in terms of their offense, again, a lot hinges in terms of talking about the Cleveland Browns results of Deshaun Watson returning to form. But when you talk about this team, Amari Cooper showed why he's still one of those top 15, 20 guys last year. I think a lot of people were kind of, on the Amari's washed, he's injured. He came back with a vengeance. Donovan Peoples-Jones had an 800-yard season, which even as someone who was a fan of him coming out of the draft, a couple of years ago, I did not expect him to have that type of a year. Like, did not expect it at all. They trade for Elijah Moore, who I think fits in as kind of their slot receiver that's going to do really well there after the Jets horribly mismanaged him. And they have Nick Chubb. I think Nick Chubb is the best running back in the league at this point. He has, 4 straight years of 1,000-yard seasons. I read an insane stat in the last 5 years per Bill Barnwell's article. He has 1,300 rushing yards over expected, which is an insane stat. And his rookie year, he had 996 yards too. So he practically has 5 straight 1,000-yard seasons. Again, you can kind of debate what the value is between him and McCaffrey and guys like Eckler who, contribute more in the receiving game. But Chubb is just an absolute beast to play against, and there's no signs of him slowing down yet. So for me, Nick Chubb, almost, combined with the receivers, combined with the total team they have, he's really what puts the Browns here at number 8 for me. I don't think you can ignore what he brings to the table anymore. And David Njoku. I still think the Browns kind of overpaid for Njoku a little bit, but was really solid last year and kind of overcame a lot of the injuries, a lot of the things that he had been dealing with in the past. Some of the major factors for where this Browns offense will finish by the end of the year: does Chubb's usage eventually catch up to him, right? We've seen this with a lot of running backs. I guess Derrick Henry recently, in terms of kind of just being injured, getting a little bit older. Obviously, Henry around 30 has been experiencing more injuries because of how heavily used he was at Tennessee, or in Tennessee, I should say. So, does that eventually catch up with Nick Chubb, who just had 302 carries last year, right? So I think there's a decent chance that you could see some Chubb regression just because of getting a little bit older, but still, again, a dynamic force in the running game. And then the wideouts behind the top two. This is kind of an interesting thing for them. I think Elijah Moore does fit in pretty cleanly as their slot receiver, but they do still have Anthony Schwartz on the team. I think they drafted a couple guys, if I'm not mistaken. I'm forgetting some of them off the top of my head. But the Browns kind of have a logjam there to figure out in terms of their wide receiver depth chart. But again, this is more focusing on the top guys than your wide receiver 4, 5s, and 6s per se. So I think they're kind of good to go there. The Dallas Cowboys. I have the Cowboys at number 7 on my list. I think Barnwell had them. I think maybe he had them at the same spot, or 8th. I'm not sure. But CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, Brandon Cooks, who they traded for from Houston, who was just in trade rumors forever. Jake Ferguson, Luke Schoonmaker, make up your tight end group, replacing Dalton Schultz. Invested a second-round pick that was pretty high in Luke Schoonmaker, but I do believe in him quite a bit. And, of course, you have Tony Pollard, who's returning to be the true RB1 now that the Albatross Zeke contract has ended. And that's one of my major factors. I don't think the contract situation is something to talk about here, even though I mentioned it with Jacobs. Pollard's already signed his franchise tag. I'm sure the injury he sustained, unfortunately, in the NFC divisional round against the Niners has something to do with that, as opposed to Saquon and Josh Jacobs, who are trying to, kind of carry their situations out. But Pollard now is kind of your RB1, who's going to be, heavily used and heavily relied upon. After he was injured, can he, sustain kind of another year of that kind of production? Filling the Dalton Schultz void, I think, is really important, but I do think they have the weapons to do that. Ferguson obviously going to be playing a bigger role, and Luke Schoonmaker ended up being my tight end 3, tight end 4 in the draft. I was kind of mad when the Cowboys picked him, just because I would have liked him for the Chargers in round 3 or something like that, but obviously the Cowboys had different ideas. This is a really solid group overall. And then Gallup wasn't himself last year, obviously, and you could see that in terms of the ACL recovery. If Gallup has another year to get right, you're talking about a decent 3-headed wide receiver monster in CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, and Brandon Cooks. And if Gallup does return to form, I do believe that is 3 top 30 guys in the league. The Miami Dolphins make the list for me at number 6. Now, I do not think the Miami Dolphins are the deepest group, and this is something that Bill Barnwell actually placed them 8th. But for me, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle being able to play all 17 games last year, you can't put them any lower than like 7 or 8. And I just, like I said, I value the wide receivers more than I do the tight ends and the running backs. And they could still make some additions, right? One of the major factors here in play that I wrote down is Dalvin Cook. Again, I don't think Dalvin Cook is going to be a dynamic difference maker, but would I play Dalvin Cook over Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson at this point? Yeah. And he does have the opportunity to still break off some big plays, even though the between the tackles numbers and analytics have kind of gone against Dalvin Cook recently. And then as an X factor, I do have Braxton Berrios, who's probably figuring to be their slot receiver right now. But in general, I don't think this Dolphins team is necessarily done building. I do think that there are still some players they can go after in free agency. I think that there are some guys that they can do to kind of make this, there are some guys they can get to make this roster a little bit deeper as a whole. But you have Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, 2 top 15 receivers. I can't place you lower than 7. And frankly, the upside of Tyreek Hill being a top 3 guy, Jalen Waddle, I think has only the chance to go up this year, along with, say, his draft classmate Devontae Smith, who we'll get to a little bit later. But those 2 guys kind of win it over for me, and that's why I do have the Dolphins maybe a little bit higher than Bill Barnwell had them. The Chargers. Let's talk about the Chargers. You guys are probably 20 minutes into this video, man. Like, dude doesn't even mention the Chargers yet. But this was Bill Barnwell's passage on the Chargers. He did rank them 5th. And Bill Barnwell said, I went back and forth between the Seahawks and the Chargers here. Both have 3 exciting wideouts with a veteran and physical force, joined by a rookie first-round pick, obviously Quentin Johnston. Both don't get much out of their tight ends despite talented options, and he ended up picking Seattle at number 4, which is kind of interesting. He does kind of go on a bit here to talk about Austin Eckler and what he's been able to do in the receiving game and his usage. And I actually think he's a little bit higher on Austin Eckler than maybe the media / Chargers fans are right now in terms of what he does for an offense. And ultimately what it comes down to for Bill Barnwell here is like the injuries. And it's something that I'm going to talk about in a minute here with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. But yeah, that is kind of the X factor for the Chargers room. And now I will get to my ranking. You can pause the video if you want to read what Bill Barnwell said, but I do have the Chargers at number 5. Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Quinn Johnson, Gerald Everett, Donald Parham. You could talk about, again, some of the depth guys. We know who the depth guys are in Joshua Palmer and Jalen Guyton and the whole bit. Darius Davis is going to play a role, but this is their main group of players that they will be relying on in the 2023 season. So, yeah, the big factor to me is wide receiver health, because I think you could ultimately argue, I think there's a pretty clear top 3. But if you were debating between the Chargers and the Seahawks, for example, I think if the Chargers had been slightly healthier last year and Mike Williams and Keenan Allen didn't miss 10 games, then I think you could rank the Chargers a little bit higher than they're going to be ranked in some of these lists in general. And another factor, I think, is Eckler and Everett being in contract years. This is a big thing for contracts. Obviously, they're going to play. They're going to want the usage. They're going to want the touches. But I think they're kind of going to ball out in terms of trying to get paid next year. They would already do that anyway. It's not like they're bad players, of course. Eckler's a great top 10 running back. Everett is a top 10, top 15 tight end, depending on how you look at it. And something that I do think hangs over the wide receiver room a little bit is the future, right? You have Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. Most likely, I don't want to say this definitively, but most likely, one of them is not going to be with the Chargers in 2024, considering the cap concessions that they're going to have to make in terms of getting cap compliant. We've talked about this a bunch on the show. So this is probably also a contract year for somebody like Mike Williams, who could get cut. For somebody like Keenan Allen, I think is less likely to get cut. Depends on his injury history and how that progresses this year as well. So ultimately for the Chargers, I think you're looking mainly at health as the factor. And I do think you want to see how some of these other players progress, right? Donald Parham has been a breakout candidate forever, and Lindsey Theory actually just wrote a great piece about him. I think the ESPN in general did like a 32 players from 32 minicamps type of thing, and the coaching staff does like Donald Parham and hopes for a kind of breakout campaign from him. Unfortunately, wasn't able to play a whole lot last year considering the injuries. 2021 dates back to what happened in Kansas City that unfortunately ended his season there. But yeah, in general, I think the Chargers have a really great offensive. I think they have really great offensive weapons, right? They're one of the deeper teams around the league. And if Keenan and Mike do get hurt this year, you're not as concerned about it in the past because you do have Quentin Johnston being your wide receiver 3 now, as opposed to, some of the other people that were wide receiver 3 before, whether that was DeAndre Carter and Josh Palmer. I feel a lot better about it being Quentin Johnston and Josh Palmer and Jalen Guyton, who's obviously coming back from injury, if Keenan and Mike do have to miss some time this season. But I sort of talked about this on Twitter as well, where it's like, there's this war between who has the better weapons between the Dolphins and the Chargers. And it's pretty simple, right? Like, I think the Chargers have the deeper team. I would argue the Chargers have the better weapons. But if you're telling me that Keenan and Mike miss 10 games again and Jalen, Waddle, and Tyreek Hill play all 34, then the Dolphins have the better weapons, right? Your best ability is availability in that sense. So I did rank the Chargers as having the 5th best playmakers in the league. Let me know where you have the Chargers down in the comments below. Now that we have talked about the Chargers, I'll try to speed this up a little bit, but I do have the Seattle Seahawks at number 4. I gave the edge to the Seahawks over the Chargers for a couple reasons. One, I think DK Metcalf has been a little bit disrespected this offseason with his placement on a lot of these lists. When we talk about like top 5, top 10, top 15 receivers, it's really hard. And again, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are kind of going to get disrespected on list 2 just because of how many great wide receivers there are, young guys around the league who are breaking out. But DK Metcalf, if he has another year with Geno Smith, I think he'll get a little bit more comfortable there. And I don't expect him to have as low of a contested catch rate that he did in 2022. I think he'll kind of have a positive regression to the mean in that sense. Tyler Lockett, and they just drafted Jackson Smith-Njigba, much like the Chargers just drafted Johnston. And they created their own 3-headed monster. Jackson Smith-Njigba was my wide receiver 1 coming out of the draft. I ended up with Quentin Johnson as wide receiver 2. But that is a nasty core you can put together. If you have DK and Tyler on the outside and JSN in the slot, that's pretty perfect. There's nothing I can do to really like criticize that, right? And DK Metcalf generally for his career has been pretty healthy. Tyler Lockett's getting a little bit older, but now if Tyler Lockett does start having some injuries and does start breaking down, you have JSN that you can replace him with, which is pretty nice. Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet are their running backs. I did not expect the Seahawks to draft another running back, but as Bill Barnwell points out in his piece, the analytics are a lot less friendly to Kenneth Walker's season last year. So that might be why they went for Zach Charbonnet a little bit earlier in the draft. Also, Pete Carroll just really likes drafting running backs. Noah Fant ended up having about 50 receptions for 500 yards last year in a kind of Gerald Everett-y low-key way where, you just kind of look at the stat sheet and he ended up having 500 yards. But Noah Fant, I think, is still a little bit untapped potential. I think he's only like 26, 27 years old, right? Can still be a breakout candidate, and Geno Smith likes throwing at him. So, yeah, the major factors for this offense, like I said, figuring out the running back logjam. I mean, you can use both Kenneth Walker and Charbonnet, but which one is kind of more your running back 1 could be a little interesting. And then I do think DK Metcalf in contested catch situations will regress to the positive mean, but it still sort of has to do that first. At number 3, I have the Cincinnati Bengals. They were number 2 on Bill Barnwell's list. Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. That's probably the best trio that you're going to get in the league. Irv Smith replaces Hayden Hurst from last year, which I do think is a little bit of a downgrade, and they still have Joe Mixon. Major factors, T. Higgins' contract. I don't think that's really going to necessarily affect his availability, but you never know with these contract situations and holdouts, even though holdouts tend to happen less than they did previously. And then Joe Mixon, whether or not he's kind of going to bounce back. I think he ended up averaging, I don't remember exactly what it was. It was like 3.4 yards per carry last year. Definitely a downgrade from what we've come to expect for somebody like Joe Mixon. So I do think a lot of the season does depend on his bounce back in terms of what this Bengals offensive season could be for them. But really hard to poke any holes in the Bengals being a top 3 team. I think you could argue that they're number 1 if you really wanted to, but I had 2 teams that I had ahead of them. Playmakers, the number 2, I have the Philadelphia Eagles, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Quez Watkins, Dallas Goedert, DeAndre Swift, Rashad Penny, and Kenneth Gainwell. Major factors for this offense is that people are going to talk about the new running backs that they do have in this offense, right? Replacing Miles Sanders with DeAndre Swift, adding Rashad Penny into the fold, still having Kenneth Gainwell, but I know that we're not supposed to necessarily talk about the offensive line and the ancillary thing to these skill players, but DeAndre Swift is going to look really good behind that offensive line. So is Rashad Penny, provided he stay healthy, and Kenneth Gainwell's still been really good near the goal line too. So it's kind of impossible to separate the Eagles' running game from their offensive line and how it stacks over all these other teams who have some of these top 10 playmakers. The Eagles have the advantage on the offensive line, and that's going to help their running game. And, they already have 2 of the top 15 receivers in the league. So, I think the Eagles have a pretty slam dunk case for number 2. Bill Barnwell had them at number 3. I could agree with that too. But, I think the top 3 being the Eagles, the Bengals, and the next team I'm going to talk about is pretty set in stone. You can make maybe some arguments for the Chargers and the Seahawks and the Dolphins in terms of potential of where they could be by the end of the year, but I think it's a pretty solid 3 there. Do you have Ken Quez Watkins bounce back in my X Factors? Not a big Quez Watkins believer, but you never know. And at number 1, I do have the San Francisco 49ers having the best playmakers in the league. I agree with Bill Barnwell's take. You got Christian McCaffrey, Elijah Mitchell in the running game. George Kittle, obviously being a tight end, having a monster year last year. Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. This stat is from Mina Kimes, the San Francisco offense pre and post CMC. They were 21st in DVOA, 19th in EPA per play, 26th in QBR, 10th in yards per attempt. And of course, once they did trade for Christian McCaffrey, they were first in DVOA, first in EPA per play, second in QBR, and second in yards per attempt. Second in QBR, by the way, while they cycled through quarterbacks, right? I think that's pretty impressive to do that post CMC. Obviously, they weren't doing as much cycling by the time Purdy was starting, but to go through all the change that they went through last year and to still have some of these playmakers like McCaffrey and Kittle have their best years is kind of crazy. And the major factor is to whether the Niners can kind of retain the top spot here going into 2023 is pretty simple. Do they have a little bit more stability at quarterback? I think that's going to be an interesting question for them to answer, whether that is talking about Brock Purdy, whether that's Sam Darnold, whether that's Trey Lance. It's most likely going to be Brock Purdy as he comes back from his elbow surgery, I believe. So I don't know. I do think that they have a chance to have more stability if it is Purdy, but obviously I think regardless with Shanahan, with this offense, they're pretty clearly above the rest of the field in terms of how much their offense and their playmakers should be respected at this point. So I will actually just recap my top 10 list really quickly, but at number 10, I had the Jacksonville Jaguars playmakers. At number 9, I had the Raiders. At number 8, I had the Browns. Number 7, I had the Cowboys. Number 6, I had the Dolphins. Number 5, I had the Chargers. Number 4, I had the Seahawks. Number 3, the Bengals. Number 2, the Eagles. And number 1, the San Francisco 49ers. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Who are your top 10 lists, your top 5 offensive playmaker lists, and where do you think the Chargers do fit in the league dichotomy, if you will? I do think there's room for the Chargers to go up. I think there's room for the Chargers to go down, depending on if things go south. But I think they're in a really good top 5 position, ultimately, when you talk about the offensive playmakers they have on this team. But that's been a long episode for me talking by myself. So hope you guys survived the episode. That'll do it for me this week. And as always, bolt up.